On March 25, 2026, inside the United Nations General Assembly chamber in New York, 54 African nations stood together and presented the world with a choice that centuries of silence had been avoiding. They called it a crime. Not a historical tragedy. Not a regrettable chapter. A crime. A crime against humanity, one of the gravest ever committed, and they asked 193 nations to say it out loud. The resolution was straightforward in its language, but what it represented was something far more consequential than mere words on paper. For the first time in modern UN history, the full assembled nations of Africa acted with a unified voice on a single, non-negotiable proposition. The transatlantic slave trade, the systematic capture, transport, and enslavement of approximately 12 million African people over 4 centuries, should be formally recognized, officially documented, and morally accountable as one of the greatest crimes against humanity. What happened next revealed something that geopolitical observers had been watching but not yet fully seeing: the weaponization of history, the refusal to acknowledge it, and the dangerous fissures opening within the global order itself. Let's begin with what actually happened in that chamber, because the mechanics matter. The African Union, representing 54 nations, presented the resolution with deliberate, coordinated strategy. They had built consensus across the continent in ways that hadn't been visible during the months of backroom negotiation and diplomatic preparation. Ministers of foreign affairs from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia had coordinated messaging. Regional power players understood what was at stake, and they moved. When the vote came, the result was not unanimous. It was 131 nations in favor. 55 nations abstained. 7 nations voted against. Among those who voted against or abstained were the United States, the European Union as a collective bloc, Israel, Argentina, and several smaller nations with historical economic ties to the transatlantic slave trade. This was not an accident. This was a choice made by capitals in Washington, Brussels, Tel Aviv, and Buenos Aires. A choice to say no to formal acknowledgement of slavery as a crime against humanity. Why would nations refuse such a resolution? That's where the script becomes less about history and more about contemporary power and economics. The architecture of reparations liability is what terrifies Western capitals. The resolution itself did not explicitly mandate reparation payments. That would come later, in mechanisms and processes that would flow from this foundational acknowledgement. But every diplomat and legal advisor in every Western capital understood the pathway. Recognition creates moral obligation. Moral obligation creates legal precedent. Legal precedent exposes liability. For the United States, the calculation was explicit and brutal. Slavery built American wealth. The fortunes extracted from centuries of slave labor, not just plantation wealth, but the banking systems, insurance industries, shipping companies, and industrial infrastructure that grew alongside the slave trade, created the economic foundation upon which American prosperity was constructed. Even today, wealth disparities between white and black Americans trace directly to slavery and its aftermath. Acknowledging slavery as a crime against humanity, at scale, in the UN General Assembly, meant opening the door to claims that Western nations cannot simply dismiss as historical or impossible to quantify. European Union nations faced a parallel calculation. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Portugal were all primary actors in the transatlantic slave trade. These were not peripheral actors. These were the architects. Britain dominated the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century. France built its wealth partly through slave labor in the Caribbean. Belgium's colonial wealth depended on extraction from enslaved peoples across Africa. The economic calculation was not theoretical. It was concrete. Acknowledge the crime, and acknowledge that the nations that committed it are still benefiting from that crime in the form of developmental advantages, accumulated capital, and structural economic dominance. Argentina's vote against the resolution reflected a different but related anxiety. The fear that if historical crimes can be reopened and accountability demanded, then Argentina's own reckoning with the disappeared during its military dictatorship could face renewed international pressure. The vote was protective of a nation's ability to move past its own crimes without facing ongoing claims. And Israel's position in this calculation reveals a more complex geopolitical maneuver altogether. The inclusion of Israel among the nations that abstained reveals pressure from Western allies to maintain unified opposition to reparations frameworks more broadly. It signals solidarity with Western capitals in resisting precedents that could expand the scope of historical accountability claims generally. And it reflects anxieties within Israeli leadership about what precedents might be set if nations could be held accountable for historical injustices in ways that could reverberate in Middle Eastern disputes. But the vote itself was not the most significant dimension of what happened. The vote was the announcement. The real event was the coordination that preceded it. For the first time in living memory, 54 African nations, with vast differences in economic development, regional power, colonial history, governance styles, and strategic alignment, moved as a unified bloc on a single issue of fundamental importance to continental identity and economic claims. This was not orchestrated by a dominant external power. This was not a Cold War proxy vote. This was not nations following the lead of a hegemonic power out of strategic necessity. This was Africa saying something about itself and demanding the world listen. The coordination required to achieve this was immense. The African Union, often criticized as a toothless institution dominated by unequal power among its members, demonstrated that when the issue touches something deeper than electoral politics or military advantage, when it touches historical trauma, continental identity, and claims on global resources, unity becomes possible. The messaging was not just about slavery, either. The broader framework being articulated was about neo-colonialism, about how slavery ended formally but was replaced by colonialism, which ended formally but was replaced by economic extraction, about how Western nations continue to structure trade relationships, debt arrangements, commodity pricing, and technology access in ways that advantage the developed world and disadvantage African nations. The resolution on slavery became shorthand for a much larger argument about historical extraction and contemporary injustice. This is where the geopolitical implications become urgent. The moment Africa's nations realize they can act together, the moment they understand that moral claims and historical justice can be weaponized in the same way that military power or economic sanctions are weaponized, the global order becomes unstable in ways that Western powers are not prepared to manage. For the United States, the position required careful calculation. Voting against the resolution was politically costly at home. It opened the administration to criticism from African American constituencies, from civil rights organizations, and from progressive elements within the broader coalition. But voting for the resolution meant accepting a framework that could generate reparations claims that would be economically impossible to satisfy without fundamentally restructuring American wealth distribution and confronting the extent to which contemporary inequality is rooted in historical extraction. The compromise was abstention. Not voting against, but not voting for either. It's a position that allows the United States to claim it didn't block the resolution while reserving the right to argue later that the resolution lacks binding force, that reparations frameworks are not obligatory, that implementation details can be managed through diplomatic negotiation rather than legal mandate. The European Union pursued a similar strategy, abstention as a way to neither endorse nor explicitly reject the resolution. It's a position that made diplomatic sense in the moment, but that signals something deeper to African nations. The Western world is collectively uncomfortable with accountability for historical crimes that built contemporary prosperity. What we're witnessing here is a moment where the post-Cold War international order, built on liberal democracy, free trade, and the premise that Western institutions and values have triumphed and should organize global affairs, is being directly challenged by nations that were historically subordinated within that order. The challenge is not being made through military means. It's not being made through economic coercion. It's being made through the very institutions that the West created to manage global affairs. It's being made through legal argument, moral claim, and coordinated diplomatic pressure. It's being made by African nations saying, your history is not finished. Your debts are not paid. And we're going to make that case at every forum available to us. Is this a strategic move designed to extract concessions and resources? Of course. But it's also something more, a reassertion of African agency in defining the terms of global conversation about how historical wrongs should be addressed. The immediate consequences of the March 25 vote are already visible. Within weeks, formal commissions were being established to document claims, to quantify historical extraction, and to begin the technical work of building reparations frameworks. These are not merely symbolic gestures. These are the early stages of a process that could fundamentally reshape how developed nations relate to African nations economically. Think about what this means concretely. If a formal UN-backed process begins quantifying the wealth extracted through slavery, The labor value stolen, the resources plundered, the economic advantage compounded across centuries. And if African nations begin presenting aggregate claims for reparations, the numbers become astronomical. Some analyses suggest that when you calculate the stolen labor of 12 million enslaved people across 4 centuries, compound interest on that extraction, and the developmental advantages that flowed to Western nations as a result, the total claim could reach into the trillions of dollars. That's not a claim that can be dismissed as impossible. It's a claim that reframes the entire debate about development assistance, debt relief, technology transfer, and trade policy. It's a claim that says, you owe us not because of charity, but because of historical crimes. You owe us because your wealth is literally built on our suffering. For Western capitals, this is a crisis of legitimacy masquerading as a legal question. It's the moment when the post-World War II order, built on the premise that the West defeated evil and earned the right to organize global affairs according to its values, faces a direct challenge. Your moral authority is compromised. You are still benefiting from crimes you haven't acknowledged. The voting bloc that abstained or opposed the resolution reveals something else worth examining: the fractures within what we commonly call the West. The United States and European Union nations were expected to move together. They did, into abstention. But other nations voting against revealed different calculations entirely. Argentina's position is instructive. It reflects a nation that went through its own reckoning with historical atrocities, the disappearances, torture, and murders of the military dictatorship, and chose to move past those crimes through transitional justice mechanisms rather than ongoing legal accountability. Argentina's government leadership saw the African resolution as potentially reopening wounds they had chosen to close. By voting against reparations frameworks for slavery, Argentina was protecting its own ability to avoid renewed international pressure on its internal history. This raises a question that the resolution itself didn't explicitly address, but that will dominate geopolitical conversation for years. If slavery becomes formally recognized as a crime against humanity requiring reparations, what about colonialism? What about the Belgian extraction from Congo? What about British colonialism in India and Africa? What about French colonialism? If we open this door, where does it stop? The answer, from African nations' perspective, is clear. It stops when justice has been addressed. It stops when the claims have been settled. It stops when the historical debt has been paid. From Western nations' perspective, it never stops. Once you acknowledge that historical crimes create ongoing liability, you open yourself to perpetual claims. The role of the Global South in this moment cannot be overlooked. Of the 131 nations that voted in favor of the resolution, many were not directly affected by the transatlantic slave trade in the same way African nations were. Many were Latin American nations with their own histories of slavery and colonialism. Many were Asian nations that saw in this moment a broader principle, that the old order, where Western nations lectured the Global South about values while extracting resources and demanding gratitude, was no longer sustainable. The vote became a referendum on the legitimacy of Western power itself. And by that measure, Western power lost decisively. This has immediate consequences for how African nations will approach other negotiations: climate reparations, technology transfer, debt relief, trade policy. If Africa can move as a bloc on slavery, they can move as a bloc on climate justice. And African nations are already framing climate change as another form of extraction, where wealthy nations grew rich through carbon emissions and now expect African nations to bear the costs of climate adaptation without compensation. Within the African continent itself, the resolution unified nations in ways that internal African disputes had not. Kenya and Tanzania, which compete for regional dominance in East Africa. Nigeria and Ghana, which compete for influence in West Africa. South Africa and Egypt, which compete for continental leadership. For a moment, all of this fell away, and the continent spoke as one voice. Will this unity last? Probably not in its current form. The pressures that divide African nations, different strategic alignments, different economic interests, different governance challenges, will reassert themselves. But what has changed is that African leadership now knows unity is possible on issues of continental significance. And that knowledge itself is geopolitically consequential. China and other emerging powers watched this moment closely. They noted that Africa could organize itself around a shared claim. They noted that Western nations were divided or defensive. They noted that the next great competition for African resources and influence might not be won through military power or traditional economic advantage, but through which external power is most willing to acknowledge historical wrongs and support African claims for justice. This is where it becomes clear that this resolution is not primarily about the past. It's about the future. It's about whether Africa will accept continued subordination within a global order designed by and for Western nations, or whether it will demand renegotiation of the terms on which it participates in that order. The Western response has been defensive and fragmented. Some voices in Western academia and policy circles argue that reparations are economically unfeasible. Others argue that tracing wealth back through centuries of history is impossible. Still others argue that nations should not be held liable for crimes committed by their predecessors, but none of these arguments address the core claim being made, that the West's contemporary advantage is built directly on slavery and colonialism. That the wealth gap between developed and developing nations is not an accident of geography or culture or governance, but a direct result of historical extraction. That acknowledging this is not about revenge, but about honest accounting. This is where you see the real anxiety in Western capitals. Because the claim, when stated plainly, is difficult to refute. The British Industrial Revolution was powered partly by wealth from the slave trade. American economic dominance was built partly on slavery and the dispossession of indigenous lands. French and Belgian wealth was accumulated through colonial extraction. Dutch merchant capital was generated through colonial trade and enslavement. These are not fringe arguments made by radical scholars. These are mainstream historical analyses, accepted by serious historians across the Western Academy. The question is not whether slavery built Western wealth. The question is whether that historical crime creates ongoing liability. What happens next becomes the central geopolitical question. The resolution passed, but resolutions are not self-executing. Reparations frameworks must be designed, negotiated, and implemented. Wealthy nations must be persuaded, through diplomatic pressure, through trade incentives, through reshaping of international relationships, to accept some form of reparations or restitution. There are multiple pathways forward. Direct cash reparations, which Western nations will resist as economically unsustainable. Debt forgiveness, which wealthy nations might accept as more politically palatable. Technology transfer and intellectual property access, which could be framed as development assistance rather than reparations. Preferential trade arrangements that give African nations advantage in global markets. Restructuring of international financial institutions to give African nations greater voice and control. The negotiation over which pathway gets pursued will determine not just the economic outcome, but the broader geopolitical trajectory of the coming decades. If wealthy nations accept significant reparations frameworks, it signals a fundamental shift in power, that the global South can demand accountability and get it. If wealthy nations find ways to avoid meaningful reparations while appearing to accept the resolution's moral claims, it signals that the old order persists despite symbolic gestures toward change. The implications for African nations themselves are equally significant. Unity is powerful, but unity around a claim that Western nations refuse to satisfy could also become a source of frustration and division. If reparations don't materialize, if African nations find themselves making repeated claims that go unmet, the moment of continental unity could sour into recrimination and renewed internal competition. The strongest African nations, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, will have the most leverage in negotiating reparations frameworks. But smaller, weaker African nations might find themselves with little to show for their participation in the unified bloc. This creates pressure for internal African negotiations about how any reparations would be distributed. There's also a question of legitimacy within African nations. Many African governments are weak, corrupt, or undemocratic. If reparations wealth flows into the hands of corrupt officials rather than benefiting actual populations, the moral authority of the entire reparations claim becomes compromised. African civil society organizations, diaspora communities, and grassroots movements will be watching to see whether governments use reparations to strengthen democratic institutions and benefit populations, or simply to accumulate more power and wealth. For the United States specifically, the geopolitical implications are profound. The Democratic Party has relied on strong support from African American voters and from African nations in UN voting blocs. The abstention on this resolution was a compromise that satisfied neither side entirely. It also signaled to African nations that American commitment to justice and human rights has limits, specifically, where those commitments might expose America to liability or economic loss. This could have consequences for future negotiations on everything from climate policy to military cooperation to trade arrangements. If African nations conclude that American support for justice claims is conditional and limited, they will discount American moral authority in future disputes. The Republican Party, if they return to power, will likely take an even more defensive stance on reparations claims. This could further alienate African American constituencies and strengthen the case that contemporary American politics is fundamentally unwilling to address historical injustices. For Europe, the implications are equally significant. European nations have built their contemporary power and wealth on the premise that they have moved beyond the nationalist authoritarianism and imperial ambitions that defined the 20th century. The abstention on this resolution signals that moving beyond history means refusing to acknowledge how that history still shapes contemporary reality. This creates a legitimacy crisis for European soft power. How can European nations claim moral authority on human rights, democracy, and justice when they refuse to acknowledge accountability for slavery and colonialism? The answer is, they can't. At least, not without addressing these claims directly. The regional implications within Africa are also worth examining. North African nations, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, have sometimes been positioned as closer to Europe and the Arab world than to sub-Saharan Africa. Their participation in the unified African vote on this resolution signals a reassertion of African identity that transcends regional divisions. West African nations, historically more closely tied to European colonial powers through trade and institutional relationships, participated in the unified vote. This suggests a shift in how they perceive their relationship to Europe, less as a continuation of colonial relationships through economic dependence, and more as a negotiation between equals over historical wrongs and future terms of engagement. Southern African nations, particularly South Africa, played a leading role in coordinating the resolution. South Africa's own transition from apartheid, a system explicitly built on racial hierarchy, gave it unique moral authority to speak about accountability for historical crimes. South Africa's leadership signals that the nation is moving away from its position in the post-apartheid period as a bridge between Africa and the West, toward a position as a leader of African interests within global forums. East African nations participated, despite their own regional competitions and divisions. This signals that even in the most divided regions, there was consensus that this issue transcended local rivalries. The precedent being set here extends far beyond slavery and reparations. If African nations can successfully demand accountability for historical crimes, what about other global South nations demanding accountability for colonialism, for intervention, for resource extraction? What about indigenous peoples demanding recognition of historical wrongs? What about smaller nations demanding recognition of how larger nations have violated their sovereignty? The resolution opens a door that, once opened, will be difficult to close. It establishes a principle that historical crimes create ongoing liability, that moral claims can be weaponized through international institutions, and that unity among formerly subordinated nations can challenge the authority of powerful nations. This is why the Western response has been so defensive. It's not really about slavery. Slavery ended in the 19th century. It's about whether the contemporary global order can survive the systematic acknowledgement of how it was built. Whether powerful nations can maintain their authority while admitting the crimes that foundation that authority. What happens next could redefine the region and the entire global South. The resolution passed, but the real negotiation is just beginning. How African nations use this victory, whether they press for meaningful reparations, whether they maintain unity, whether they translate this moment into concrete economic and political gains, will determine whether this was a symbolic gesture or the beginning of a genuine reordering of global power. The Western response will be equally consequential. Will wealthy nations find ways to address reparations claims, or will they attempt to manage the resolution through diplomatic delay and negotiation designed to minimize actual obligations? Will they recognize that the legitimacy of the contemporary global order depends on some degree of acknowledgement and accountability? Or will they attempt to preserve power by refusing these claims? The answer to these questions will shape international relations for decades. It will determine whether the post-Cold War order, which has lasted 35 years, continues into the coming decades, or whether we're witnessing its fundamental transition into something different. Something where the global South has genuine voice. Something where historical crimes are acknowledged. Something where the terms of global engagement are negotiated rather than dictated by powerful nations. For Africa, for the Global South, for everyone watching how powerful nations respond to coordinated demands for justice, the next months and years will be the moment when the real stakes become clear. This is where the script that was written centuries ago, the script of Western dominance and Global South subordination, faces its most serious challenge yet. And the question that will define the next era of international relations is simple but consequential. Will the world accept a genuine reckoning, or will it find new ways to avoid the consequences of its history? That's the question hanging over everything that comes next.